Welcome to Alive to Thrive. Today we have a special guest, Jenna Harper. Welcome, Jenna. Our channel is all about health and wellness, and I was just saying to you, Jenna, the other day that I think in mental health, we kind of take out the physical aspect of being. And for our listeners, I mean, the physical part, like we don't look at what people's nutrition is. We're not looking at, their physical activity. A lot of times, like the main intervention is pharmacological intervention. I'm not saying for all practitioners. I'm kind of just saying from, what I've seen. And I think that there's things we could improve on there. And then from the physical aspect in hospitals, this is the area I've more predominantly worked in during my career as an occupational therapist, is they're not looking at the mental health aspect of how it affects your physical function. So there's a big gap on both ends of care where mental health care is not being seen as a physical problem and physical problems are not seen as mental problems. They're being treated almost mutually exclusive. And I think to have a healthier healthcare system in society, we need to start understanding the overlap. So, and I think as your experience in mental health, you could kind of attest to that, and we'll just kind of get to that in the interview questions of your experience in life working as a trauma specialist. As a sexual assault advocate and an expert in this field, what are some of the psychological and physiological repercussions of sexual assault? Because I think that, we hear about sexual assault on the news, or you might have a friend, or you might have experienced it yourself. But again, even when you experience it yourself, you don't necessarily know that these things are happening as a result of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. There can be such a spectrum. I think there are some acute as well as long-term effects. So acutely, there's something called tonic immobility, which is important to understand. We've been taught that there's either fight or flight.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So that when you experience a trauma, whether that's sexual assault or something else, that immediately you're either going to run away or you're going to fight back. But what oftentimes happens because of the way that your brain is responding and your limbic system, your prefrontal cortex shuts down, your HPA acts as your hypothalamus to your pituitary to your adrenals, there's this flood of hormones in your body. And what sometimes that can cause is for you to freeze. So when you think about a deer caught in headlights playing possum, it is something that is taken from evolution that is passed down to human beings. And one of those tactics that we do sometimes is to freeze up. And so sometimes acutely what you do is you freeze and you can't move. And that's how you survive. That's your body trying to survive. So that's a reaction sometimes to a trauma. Another thing that's important to remember is the way that your brain is recording things and the way that your brain is retrieving things is going to be very different from the way that your brain is going to be working when it's not experiencing a trauma, which means that your storyline is not going to be a story. It's not going to be in chronological order. It can be chunky. There can be pieces missing, and it's very sensory. So one of the effects of that is that when getting triggered or when you go back into the moment, whether that's reliving an actual memory, whether that's your body going back into the physiological feeling of your heartbeat or whatever feeling that might be, moments of panic, kind of getting foggy brain, not being in your body, there can be certain sensory elements, especially smell, that trigger that and bring you back to that moment. Having flashbacks can be things, insomnia. There can be physiological things. So migraines, lower abdominal pain without explanation. Those are common elements. Night terrors. When it comes to eating disorders, so you might not be able to control things in your life, like the person who hurt you and what happened in that moment, but you can control what you eat. So some people might develop an eating disorder. Issues with connection in terms of relationships to friends and family, especially if they blame or they shame or they don't understand and they're not supportive. And that could be from friends and family. That could be from a church community. That can be from a school, a friend group. Could be from the criminal justice system. One of the primary causes of trauma. So when we think about trauma is not just the car accident. It's not the actual sexual assault. There can be two people who are in the same exact car accident. One is experiencing post-traumatic stress. The other's not. It's because trauma is a reaction to an event. And so it's really important for us to recognize that nobody's wrong in what they're experiencing. Any reaction is a normal reaction. And so what I tell people to expect is here are some common things that sometimes people experience, but you're unique, and how you're going to experience that is going to be unique. It might come right away. It might not come for years. And what's important to know is that no journey is ever alike for two people. And it's important to be patient with yourself and to be patient with other people in your life who have experienced sexual violence, to normalize whatever it is that they are experiencing as unique and okay for what their body is responding to.
Wow. You were talking about the freezing as a part of a evolutionary response, like a protective response. How does the freezing, could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a mixture of different hormones that come out from the HPA axis, which is your body saying, there's something coming at me, I need to protect myself. So if anyone's into sharks, it also happens.
That's what I thought right away.
Yes.
But it just
if you tickle the underside of its nose, it just floats up. It's really interesting. So evolutionarily what happens is the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of your brain, it shuts down and we go into our limbic system, which is our much more like animalistic, ancient system in our brain. And that takes over. And sometimes what that's teaching us is to survive, you freeze. And that's not always advantageous when you think about a deer caught in headlights.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what we know is that a high percentage of people who've experienced sexual violence experience freezing. And if you've experienced sexual violence before, your chances of experiencing freezing are higher. If you've experienced childhood sexual abuse or domestic violence, the neural pathways that have formed in your brain, they teach you to stay. Right? Those when we build pathways in our brains, they're like so much deeper when they're traumatic pathways. And so our brain is going to say, okay, yes, they're emotionally charged. And so they're really deep. And so when we see this, this trauma is happening, how did I survive when I was a kid? How did I survive when I was in that relationship? We go into that survival pattern. It's not a thinking, because actually our ability to make logical, rational decisions shuts down with our prefrontal cortex, or is limited, and we have limited access to it.
Wow.
Kind of like when you're watching a scary movie.
Yes. And
she runs out of the doorway, or she runs upstairs rather than out of the house. I think someone's at the door.
Okay. A minor interruption with a door knock, but hey, life happens. So just to summarize what we were talking about is we were talking about what happens to the brain when you experience trauma, and the idea where sometimes the person begins to freeze. Some people freeze because you said they're possuming. Could you explain the possuming a little bit more? Because I think I had to have clarification on that as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's this, the phrase playing possum, which is play dead, because when an animal is looking dead, then another animal doesn't want to eat it because it could get sick from eating something that's dead. So it was something that was advantageous, and I think could still be advantageous for possums. Maybe, I don't know. But like I said before, like, it's not always going to be advantageous for like deer who get caught in headlights. They see the headlights and they don't run away, they freeze. For survivors, I'm not making a judgment one way or another. What happens when you freeze, if you survived, that's a strength. And however you survived what you experienced is strong, right? That is a pro. That is something that you did right. And that's the viewpoint that I come away with for people who experience freezing and tonic immobility. But it can be something that can be really powerful for people to understand that, that was my brain. It's not because something was wrong with me. Like, a lot of people over the years have come to me and said, I don't know why I just couldn't move. I don't know why I couldn't run away. I don't know why I didn't fight back.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is, well, maybe you were scared of what would happen if you tried.
Yeah.
But also, it was your brain doing what it does.
Yeah, and that can protect you.
Yeah, and that can feel really validating and normalizing for people who have experienced it.
And I know I've experienced, I mean, I haven't experienced rape, but I've experienced shock, that reaction when something like jumps out or something happens unexpectedly and I just freeze. I literally was chasing a possum one time because I thought it was my cat, and it turned around and went, and I literally just like stood there like, I'm sorry, possum, but I didn't know to move. I just froze. So yeah, it's a real nervous system reaction. And what I was saying too, as when you were talking about that, is it made me go back to this trauma series that I recently took. It's trauma experts around the world talking about what happens to your nervous system when you undergo trauma. And Jenna, you were describing part of what I learned in the class is that, the old part of your brain starts to kick in where like you're always hyper vigilant and everything is kind of in a fight state. And the prefrontal cortex is not operating, the part of your brain where you can make decisions and look at things kind of from an outside perspective and plan and organize your life and decide what direction you want to do. So you're kind of in just a constant state of crisis. And they were saying, these trauma experts, that people that undergo trauma, sometimes that they end up seeking out dangerous behavior or things because they're constantly in that fight or flight state, so they can never just enjoy the moment. So I was saying about like jumping out of a plane or something spontaneous, because you're constantly in a state of fear. And then so I guess my point is that people that undergo trauma are not able to live in the moment. And the effects of that is that it's not just a one-time occurrence. It was raped, it was horrible, you have that memory and you move on. It's literally affecting your entire life. It's affecting your ability to live in the moment and to be able to function in that moment.
Yeah, and everybody does experience it differently.
Yeah.
So whereas one person who experiences sexual violence can really struggle with different parts of their life for their entire life, and where other people might not. And again, it is a journey. So like you might think, oh, I'm over it, that happened a long time ago. Or I get the question a lot, I've gotten a lot from my students saying, how do I get over this? How do I heal?
Yeah.
But healing is not just an end note, because something in your life might happen and it comes back up. And that might not have anything to do with the sexual assault. It could have to do with losing a family member. It could have to do with losing a job or moving or any sort of stressful event. And so hypervigilance can be something that is experienced so that people do more adrenaline seeking, but it could also be something where someone isolates themselves because when they go out in the world, they are so hypervigilant and they're constantly on guard. And it is hard to be part of the world. It's hard to be in relationships because you're constantly guarded and you're constantly, your heart beats faster and you're feeling flush and you're tight in your shoulders. And so I think it's important to talk about the feelings within your body, about how that might register to somebody. And it can feel different for different people, what that feels like, especially as you walk through this world and you get triggered, right? What happens when you get triggered is similar to what happens during that trauma. You no longer have access to your prefrontal cortex and what feels safe to you and what doesn't feel safe to you. And so you might be like waiting at a bus stop, which is a pretty normal activity for you, but then it feels really unsafe at another time when you're getting triggered.
Wow. Yeah. So, and in this trauma series, it was kind of interesting too, because they were talking about, in order to retrain the brain, is that you have to do, or you don't have to, but it helps to do activities that do mind-body integration, so that the brain is working with the body in the moment to retrain those neural pathways. So they were saying like things like martial arts, or that's not your thing, yoga, or different things where you're having to move your body and mind in a coordinated, harmonious pattern.
Sure.
To get it out of that fight or flight state. So I thought that was really interesting. But sorry, to get to the point, I go on tangents, is trauma is not like a one-time thing. It affects people in many different ways, and it affects not only them, but it affects their romantic relationships, their friendships, their familial relationships, their relationships at work. It's affecting our whole society. So the people that have undergone trauma, it's just not them. It's our whole society is hurting when somebody else hurts. So what was that one Martin Luther King quote where it was like an injustice, and one place is an injustice everywhere. You know, it's not just an injustice that happens in the U.S. It's an injustice that happens across the world, because we don't live in like a bubble, and we're all interconnected. So that example of, we can't just say, okay, well, this is just one group, it's happening to all of us, because we're all in some way or another affected by that. So that's why I think we have to start talking about it, and we have to start treating it, and we have to start acknowledging it so that we can heal as a society. And then I have so many questions, but I have a few more questions. Let's see. One of my questions was, why do you think a lot of times our society, talking about how they view things, why do you think that they tend to victim blame? Because I know that happens a lot. Like, well, immediately to women, why were you wearing that night? Or why were you out by yourself? Or even, I was in New Zealand, and that woman who was doing backpacking, there was a lot of negative comments I have also heard, you know, well, like, oh, well, why was she traveling alone? Or, you know, why was she, you know, well, they were just saying different criticisms. And the thing is that you should never be criticized or blamed for a violent act perpetrated to you. You know, we shouldn't live in a society that like women have to limit what they do, or anybody has to limit what they do to try to avoid a violent act.
Yeah. And victim blaming causes trauma. It can oftentimes cause more trauma than the actual violence against them, the sexual violence. It's a betrayal. It's a secondary betrayal by the people in their lives. So why do people victim blame? I think that there's a couple of reasons. I think power and control is at the core of that as well. We don't want to believe that bad things just happen in this world, and we don't want to accept them. We want to think there's an explanation as to why that happens. So if we can explain it by, oh, that person wore this, or that person chose to do this, especially when we know the person who committed the act of violence. Well, I know this person wouldn't do that unless the other person tempted them in some way, did something to get them to do it to them. Because grappling with the idea that we know somebody who could do something, who could sexually assault another person, is something that's oftentimes just too hard for us to bear. So instead, what we want to do is blame the person who was hurt, because we want a sense of control. I think back to a time where my first reaction was to victim blame. There was a friend of mine who was sexually assaulted. She was walking home alone at night from a bar. That didn't cause somebody to jump her. That person who saw her, it was his choice to jump her.
Yeah.
And my first reaction was, oh, why did you walk home alone? Even within me, someone who's trained in doing this. And so I had to explore, why was that my first reaction? And I felt so terrible because I wish I could have done something. And I wanted an explanation as to why it happened. And if I could have explained it by something else, because she walked home alone, then I didn't feel as responsible. And so it's really important for us to understand. And if we also have these rules to abide by, if you don't walk home alone at night, if you don't wear that short skirt, if you don't get wasted, then it's not going to happen to you. So when working with prosecutors, one of the things that we learn is that having a woman on your jury is actually worse than a man, because oftentimes there's more victim blaming. Because if I, as a woman, don't do those rules, then I'm not going to get hurt. But what we know is that 51% of women who are raped by their intimate partner. It's not because of the skirt they're wearing. It's not because they're drinking. It's because their partner, their husband, their wife, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their hookup buddy, that's the person who hurt them. Over half of women. So those are not the factors that are to blame. I think it really does have to do with us wanting to have a sense of power and control in this world.
I remember I walked into the Bridgeview courthouse by the area where I live and seeing like the domestic violence court and thinking, wow, like there's a whole court designated for domestic violence for people that are in a relationship with each other, are hurting each other, and there's a whole court. It happens so often that there's an entire court dedicated to just domestic violence. And I remember thinking that that's so sad, and we have to change that.
Yeah.
And that leads to my nenext question. Can you talk about the work that you did? Well, oh shoot, I had one other question before my other question that led from the last question, so here we'll just go with that one. Can you talk about the work that you did with a little bit more with training first responders? Mm-hmm. So people, after somebody has had a sexual assault, the people that come, the police officer, all those people,
sure.
Nurse.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is understanding what we've just been talking about. What is trauma? How does it affect somebody? One of the things that I heard overwhelmingly when working with police and with other people is, I think that person is lying because their story is inconsistent, because there were pieces that were missing, because they're leaving things out, when in reality that's what a traumatized brain is going to sound like.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So it's understanding the neurobiology of trauma. I think the first question that should come out of somebody is, what is it that you need and how can I support you? Even if you're a police officer, even if you're a prosecutor, because oftentimes we think we know what that person's going to want. You want to put that person away, or you want to go to the hospital, or you need this, you should do that.
Yeah.
When all that person has had happen to them was taking all of their power and control away. Yeah. So what we need to do is ask, what can I do to support you? What is it what is your concern right now, and how can I support you with that concern? Yeah. Be honest and transparent. So there's the term being trauma informed, and one of the primary tenets of that is being transparent. Don't promise things that you can't do. Build a relationship on respect and support. Give them as many options as you possibly can within your role. So law enforcement officers probably have less of that than, for example, an advocate, someone whose job is just to be there and support them with housing and food and counseling and other services. Whereas a law enforcement officer needs to explain to the survivor, even though this happened to you, it's not your case. It's the state's case. And they're the ones who are going to decide what happens. And being transparent with all of what that means from the start and giving them the options. And then letting them choose what's best for them. And trusting that they know.
So wait, can you explain what you mean by it's the state's case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the state is going to the prosecutor. So it's once someone reports, in the vast majority of jurisdictions, once that person reports, then it is up to law enforcement to investigate that. Different jurisdictions work it in different ways, but sometimes it's it automatically gets sent to the DA, but sometimes it's up to the discretion of the law enforcement officer whether or not they're going to send that to the DA, the district attorney, the prosecuting attorney. Then they decide, can I win this case? If they don't have a jury that they can sell it to, if they don't believe the victim, if they don't think it's going to be strong enough, then oftentimes they're not going to go for the case. Even when a survivor says, I want you to stop, this is hurting me, this is hurting my family, never mind. Oftentimes they're going to be like, no, we're going to go forward on it because it's not their case, it's the state's case. Yeah. And that can be really hard, and it's important for survivors to know that up front, what to expect with those cases.
Wow. And I think that talking about how society handles rape and sexual trauma, I thought that I had heard a few years ago, it was a news reporting about how there was like a bunch of backlog in the rape kits, and have you? Yeah. Are you aware? I'm sure you are. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Every state there's a backlog. Working with that was one of the lowest points in my career when I got that stack of in my state in Oregon. because once I started hearing about it, I wanted to know what our backlog looked like, and I saw the stack, and it dated back to before we were born.
Wow.
And it was a very hard moment to feel like I failed in training people to care about these cases, and that you need to send forward these cases. So there's a backlog in basically everywhere. There's always going to be a backlog because there's not enough resources. People who work at that lab, they're very labor-intensive kits to do the forensic evidence, to analyze the forensic evidence. But it really has been huge, the amount of backlog that exists pretty much everywhere. I mean, when I was working in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which was 2006, 2007, there was a huge backlog in the Chicagoland area that the Human Rights Committee found, or Human Rights, an organization had found and written a report on. So this has been going back for a long, long time. A lot of times victims are not believed, and those cases just don't go anywhere. And even when they are believed, they're hard cases to prosecute.
Wow. So yeah, we need to change that, obviously, and moving forward, and I'm trying to support. Do you think it's also like a funding?
It is a funding issue.
Funding, right?
And because of all the news around it, there's been more funding that you can get toward it. But it isn't always made a priority. And because there is a lot of belief that victims lie, that they're trying to get back at somebody, when really 2 to 8% of cases are false reports that are reported to police. It's quite low. The vast majority of them are actual real reports.
Yeah.
It is recantations or people saying I lied about it. Those are more common because for many people it's the only way to say stop. I don't want to do this. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and since the current administration right now, it's been the Trump administration, how has funding been to your former agency that you worked for?
So I think funding is always a huge struggle. We are not even close to covering our needs by any means. We haven't seen a significant cut in any of our funding at this point. VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which was passed in 1994, is one of the main funders of my organization that I was previously working for in most domestic violence sexual assault agencies. It was temporarily renewed, but it's always hard to get reauthorization for it every so often when that comes up. And it was a battle again. It was up for reauthorization September 2018. It was put off until I believe December, and then again February, because we always try and get more to help to try and make a dent in this huge issue that is affecting so many people.
Yeah, so I think it's great. Again, we keep talking about it, fund it, acknowledge it,
Yes.
so we can eliminate it. Okay, so I want you to now talk about the work that you did in the schools, because that's prevention. So if we can kind of prevent things from happening, then that's the most ideal situation. And I think that also goes right back to like my main point of this show, the podcast and the YouTube, is to have us be able to talk about mental health and positive mental health and positive physical health and positive overall wellness, and that starts with prevention. So please talk about the prevention.
Yeah, for sure. So prevention, the program that I worked in, we really took a look at research and what are the risk factors for perpetration, what are the protective factors that buffer against some of those risk factors, and then we based curricula for education on that. And so I think of it as the good and the gunk. There's some gunk in our society. We all know that there's some screwed up things in our society. Taking a look at the history of oppression, that people have been treated differently in our society, and they continually be treated different. When we take a look at who experiences sexual violence at higher rates, of course we think of women, but it's women of color. It's people who identify as trans. It's bisexual people. It's people with developmental disabilities.
Yeah.
So we see people who have marginalized identities experience it at higher rates. So obviously we need to take a look at why some people think that they can hurt other people, like because of those identities, that they respect those people's bodies more. Some people's bodies, we give them more respect, and some people, we give them less respect based on those identities. So we really need to take a look at that. We need to take a look at victim blaming attitudes, because we know those are connected to perpetration. We need to take a look at building empathy where there are empathetic deficits, putting yourself into someone else's shoes. So that leads us to more the health promotion aspect of it. I think so many of us haven't had healthy relationships modeled for us from our parents, from family members, definitely not from TV and the media. When we take a look at like the most popular stuff that we were raised on, like Beauty and the Beast, she's held prisoner.
Yeah.
She's held prisoner, and like he won't let her go. And it's supposed to be this story of seeing beyond skin deep, but like he would have angry outbursts. If someone is throwing plates, if someone's screaming at you, you don't need to see beyond that. You deserve to be treated better. You shouldn't have to work on somebody until they treat you decently and they don't emotionally abuse you and intimidate you.
Wow.
Right? That is a scary message. We're upholding that as this beautiful love story. Even things like The Little Mermaid, where she has to sell her voice off to be able to be with the man that she wants to be with. The Notebook, which is also the way that she, in the movie The Notebook, the way that she gets he gets her to go out with him is by hanging from the Ferris wheel and saying, I'll let go if you don't go out with me. I will kill myself if you do not go on a date with me. When you put it that way, I think we would all agree that's not healthy. But The Notebook, when we were growing up, was like the thing, like the most romantic thing. So we need to take a look at a critical eye with the media that we're consuming and take a look at, okay, well, what is some of the healthy stuff? What are some of the movies that are upholding healthy communications, consent, respecting people's boundaries, learning how to draw your own boundaries? So the curricula that we had was, what are boundaries? How do we recognize when we're comfortable and uncomfortable? How do we communicate that to somebody? How do we handle it when someone communicates a boundary to us, which is where rejection comes in, right? How do we handle rejection when someone says, hey, I don't want a hug right now? How do we ask for a hug? How do we make sure that when we're hooking up with somebody, we know that they feel comfortable and safe and they're into it 100%? That is my definition of consent. So we need to build those, we need to build those ideas of what a healthy romantic and sexual relationship is. And like, I did that with high schoolers, sure. I didn't get this education. And my parents didn't get this education. At all. We all need to be talking about what it actually means. Like, no means no is such a low bar. We need to be teaching people, hook up with people when they actually want to hook up with you. Not because you manipulated them into it, you've guilted them, you've pressured them into it. That's actually sexual assault. So it's promoting healthy relationships while analyzing the society and the stuff that they've already been taught by high school that we have to unlearn. Right? And so when talking about high school, that's what it is. But when we start doing prevention at such a young age of, you don't have to hug your grandma if you don't want to hug grandma. You don't have to go hug your uncle if you don't want to hug your uncle. Because your body is your own. And you get to decide who gets to hug it. And you get to decide what boundaries you hold. We could be doing that at such a young age.
I love that idea of talking about boundaries. Especially... Amy Schumer was talking about this too in some of her comedian skits, because I feel like she's also an activist, and she was saying that, what was she saying? The part of this podcast and YouTube that I was talking about where we don't even know that it's happening, like that we're being conditioned like this, and she touched on that. She was saying, like, when we're teenagers or we get older and we're young adults, and it's like, why are you going out with these jerks, or why are you letting him treat you like that? But then when we're like little girls and the little boy hits us, we go to our moms and we're like, yeah, he was hitting me and it was horrible. And they're like, oh, that just means he likes you. So like hitting equals good. And like you were saying, you know, we're allowing bad behavior and saying it's just okay.
So we're normalizing it.
We're normalizing it, and then later on saying, well, silly rabbit, why are you going out with these guys that are so bad for you? And it's like, I don't know. Well, this is why. So we need to start, I think that work is so important. We really need to fund and support that. about having healthy relationships and about boundary setting and kind of about having a healthy ego.
Yeah.
Accepting rejection.
And there's not very much funding whatsoever for prevention. Like in VAWA, that's not there. There's barely any prevention funding out there.
So yeah, that's our hope for the future, is more focus on prevention. Because if you can prevent it, then you can prevent all these other negative impacts on society and through the generations. Okay, so what was, I guess I'm kind of answering this, but I want you to also answer as you feel comfortable. How can we as a nation improve sexual and relational health?
First of all, we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think that as a nation, we're not comfortable talking about sex.
Yeah.
You know,
definitely.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Like the amount of people who watch pornography.
Yeah.
Like when you turn on a TV, when you see billboards, when you flip through a magazine, sex is there, but we don't talk about it. We're very uncomfortable talking about sex, especially like specific cultures, depending on what culture we come from. But it is very stigmatized to talk about sex, even when it's healthy sex. It's hard to get into the school system sometimes to talk about what consent is. Like saying, yes, I would be okay having, like, yes, I'm into this. So I think step number one, we have to make it less stigmatized, talking about sex and sexuality. Even if you're asexual, even if you take a vow of celibacy, you're going to have people around you having sex. So knowing how to talk about that and knowing what it means to be in a healthy sexual relationship versus an unhealthy one, important. We need healthy models to show people what it means to be in a healthy relationship. So rather than having the garbage TV show where, you know, you see two people lock eyes across the room who've never met each other and they just have sex without having a conversation about like, hey, are you into this? Like, what's your STI status? Should we use protection? What's your name? We don't see the models of people having the types of conversations of health, like good sexual health. There are some shows out there that are talking about it more and more. We're seeing it come up and flourish in some aspects, like Jane the Virgin, which I think is in a really amazing show.
Oh, I love this show.
I know, it's great. It's great. So there are shows like that I think that we can look to as examples, and I think that we just need more people who make different forms of media who are upholding a healthy ideal for that. If people are going to access porn where people are actually consenting. So it's hard to find. You have to pay for it. But we do know that there is a connection between accessing porn where people are not showing healthy consent and perpetration. Not to say if you watch porn you're going to perpetrate. That is not what that's not what I'm saying. But what we do know is that a lot of porn contains a lot of violence. Most mainstream porn contains a lot of violence. And people can practice BDSM, bondage, domination, sadism, submissive, masochism, domination. They can practice that in a healthy way with consent, but that is not what 50 Shades of Grey shows. That is not what most mainstream porn, like Pornhub, shows us. So I think that we need to be upholding consensual elements within all different forms of media. We need to be talking to children about consent. And I know that that's really hard. Like as a parent, if you haven't had that modeled for you, how do you do that? There are resources out there.
Yeah. We definitely have to be more comfortable with talking about sex and not, hiding it behind doors. I remember my aunt is from Germany and she was talking about how weird we are here. She's like, guys are so like afraid of sex. We have all these beaches where we have the nude beaches and we're comfortable with our bodies and we're comfortable talking about sex. So yeah, I think that we would feel a lot more comfortable with each other, with our own sexual identity, and have a lot less like repression if we're able to be freely talking about it. Didn't you also say something about one of your classes to the ones in high school talking about healthy orgasms as well? Could you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, the orgasm gap.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
So within what we see is that within like queer relationships, and when I say the word queer, I mean people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual. For sexual orientations, we see that people who are in queer relationships experience more orgasms than women who are in queer relationships experience more orgasms and sexual pleasure in comparison to women who are in heterosexual relationships. Because oftentimes when it's a heterosexual relationship, the pleasure is really centered with the penis or the man if it's a cisgender man, if it's a straight cis relationship.
Yeah.
So I think that we need to talk about why it is that male pleasure is centered more often. Why is it that men? It is not because a woman takes longer, a person who has a vulva and a vagina. It's more difficult for them to orgasm. It's just that people don't talk about it, people don't explore it. And when people think about sex, what they think about is a P and a V, right? A penis and a vagina, that type of sex. And sex can mean so many different things. And only 29% of people who have vulvas and vaginas orgasm from just this alone.
Yeah, wow.
So that's something that people need to take note on. When you watch TV, people think that this is what sex is.
Yeah.
And it's so much more than that. Sex doesn't end when a penis ejaculates.
Yeah.
Sex can mean lots of different things, and everybody can find different pleasures in their body in different ways. And we're all unique people. There's not one move or a set of moves. There can be some general things, but that's why we need to learn to communicate better. What are you into? What is it that feels good for your body?
Yeah.
Asking and talking about that, which I understand is awkward because we don't ever see that modeled.
Yeah, and if we're not talking about it ever, and then it comes to it, and I think, especially for women, they have to be able to communicate safely what they like in order to be able to feel free enough to orgasm. We need to make that a conversation that we're having, and to have healthier relationships with our partners and healthier relationships with sex.
And feel comfortable and safe in that context.
Yeah.
And not feel like you have to perform for your partner. What research shows us, Girls and Sex, that's a great book, Peggy Ernstein. What research shows us is that oftentimes women describe a successful sexual encounter as when they get their partner off. Yeah. And they're performative. Yeah. They're performing for their partner. They're not actually thinking about what brings my body pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's have a sexual revolution. Okay, so thank you so much, Jenna. Like, the wealth of information was amazing, and you were very good at talking about these topics, and I feel like I learned a lot. So I hope that our viewers learn a lot, and thank you again.
You're welcome.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Until next time. Bye-bye.